At the peak of his life, Leo Tolstoy stood where most people only dream of reaching. He had wealth that could buy anything, fame that crossed continents, a family that loved him deeply, and a legacy already etched into the fabric of world literature. His novels, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, were hailed not just as books, but as monuments of human thought. Scholars praised him, crowds adored him, kings and commoners alike knew his name. And yet, behind the polished doors of his estate, a terrifying silence settled over his soul. Every morning he awoke with a hollow ache, one he could neither name nor numb. A question had begun to haunt him, first as a whisper, then as a roar. What is the meaning of life if it all ends in death? This wasn't idle philosophy. It was a spiritual wound, a chasm that widened with every passing day. The applause of the world, once comforting, now sounded like the hollow clap of ghosts. He began to see his achievements not as triumphs, but as illusions, beautiful, fleeting, and ultimately meaningless. Imagine having everything, yet waking up with dread, not because you fear losing it, but because you realize it cannot save you. Tolstoy wrote that he felt like a man suspended over a dark abyss, clinging to a fragile branch, while death, the great beast, waited below. No matter how tightly he held on, no matter how high he had climbed, he knew the branch would break. And when it did, nothing he had accomplished would remain. He tried to quiet the storm with reason. He turned to science, to philosophy, to the great thinkers of history. But their words were like sand slipping through his fingers. They explained how life worked, but not why it mattered. If this story is already beginning to stir something inside you, stay with us. What Tolstoy discovered next would not only change his life, but challenge everything we think we know about meaning, purpose, and peace. And if you've ever felt that quiet ache, that suspicion that success might not be the answer, you're not alone. This story is for you. Because the journey Tolstoy was about to take was not toward more greatness. It was a descent into despair, into silence, and eventually into something far more profound. As the world outside celebrated him, Tolstoy's inner world collapsed. Each day, he lived two lives. One was public, honored guest, wise author, proud father. The other was private, silent, sleepless, and shadowed by a single paralyzing realization. If death erases everything, then what does any of this mean? He didn't try to escape the question. He interrogated it. With the intensity of a man drowning, he turned to the only tools he had known to trust: reason, analysis, logic. He read deeply: Schopenhauer, Kant, Pascal, the existentialists. He hoped their insights would offer some handhold in the dark. But the more he read, the darker it became. Philosophy offered questions masquerading as answers. Science, colder still, reduced life to the firing of neurons and the accident of biology. He searched the stars for meaning, but found only lifeless space. He examined the cells of his body and found only mechanisms. No soul, no permanence, no point. And so, reason failed him. This wasn't a metaphorical despair, it was real. Tolstoy admitted in his private writings that he could no longer walk with a rope in hand or a rifle loaded. The temptation to end everything was so strong he feared his own footsteps. He wasn't playing with darkness, he was living inside it. And yet, something in him resisted. Even at the edge of the abyss, a quiet force pulled him back. He didn't understand it yet. It wasn't logic, it wasn't hope, but it was enough to keep him breathing. He began to notice a strange truth. The people around him, the other artists, aristocrats, thinkers, were quietly crumbling too. Many masked their despair behind wine, affairs, applause. But beneath it all, they were just as lost. The illusion of meaning, careers, publications, prestige, it kept the machine running, but it didn't satisfy the soul. The deeper Tolstoy went, the more he began to suspect a terrifying possibility. What if everything the world told us to chase, success, greatness, recognition, is built on a lie? And if it is, where do we go next? Let's pause here, because this is the moment many people reach in their own lives. Maybe not as dramatic, not as public, but deeply real. The moment when everything that once seemed important starts to feel hollow. If you've ever felt this disillusionment, like the ladder you've been climbing is leaning against the wrong wall, you're not alone. And if this resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore stories that don't just entertain, they awaken. What came next for Tolstoy was not an answer, but a shift in focus. He began to notice something strange. The people who seemed most at peace were not the successful, not the educated, not the elite. They were the poor, the laborers, the forgotten. And in their quiet lives, he saw something that would change everything. Tolstoy had spent decades searching for answers in palaces of thought, in libraries, in salons, in the polished words of scholars and philosophers. But now, stripped bare by despair, he turned his gaze somewhere entirely unexpected, toward the people who had never asked the questions that tormented him, the peasants. He observed them in silence, those who rose with the sun, worked the soil with their hands, and returned home to candlelight and prayer. These were not men and women who had read Kant or debated moral theory. They had no wealth, no fame, no legacy awaiting them. And yet, they smiled. They laughed. They grieved their dead and loved their children without sinking into the abyss that haunted him. At first, Tolstoy was skeptical. Was their peace merely ignorance? A blind acceptance of life because they lacked the intellect to question it? But the more he watched, the more he saw something different. These people were not blind. They endured suffering every day, hunger, loss, illness, death. And yet, they met these things not with panic or despair, but with a strange, unshakable calm. They were not pretending that life made sense. They were living as if it did. Tolstoy began to walk among them. He spent time with farmers, blacksmiths, mothers, midwives. He asked questions, but what struck him was not their answers. It was the way they lived, with rhythm, with connection, with humility. They did not debate the meaning of love. They embodied it. In the way they shared bread, held their children, or bowed their heads in silence before their meals. They did not ask if life had meaning. They lived as if it did. And slowly, something began to shift in Tolstoy. Not a revelation, not a dramatic turning point, but a quiet, persistent thought. What if the meaning I've been chasing isn't something to discover, but something to surrender to? In the stillness of their world, he saw a truth that had eluded the greatest minds of his time. That meaning is not found in words, but in presence. Not in theories, but in being. The peasants had no need to construct meaning. They were woven into it. If this is striking a chord with you, take a moment to reflect. In a world constantly shouting that meaning comes from achievement or recognition, it's easy to forget that life's deepest truths often whisper from the simplest places. If this story is helping you remember that, we invite you to share it. Help this message reach someone else who might need it. Because what Tolstoy was beginning to see was radical, that the life he had once dismissed as small was, in fact, immense. That the forgotten had remembered something the elite had lost. And this realization would break open everything he thought he knew about truth, faith, and the soul. Tolstoy had long prided himself on being a man of reason. Faith, to him, had been little more than a superstition, useful for peasants perhaps, but far too primitive for a mind like his. For years he dismissed religion as a relic, a way to comfort the ignorant in the face of death. But now, as he stood in the shadow of despair, he began to look again, and what he saw shook him. The peasants did not cling to faith as an escape from suffering. They walked with it through suffering. Their belief in God was not an argument. It was a rhythm. It pulsed through their actions, their rituals, their silences. It was not something they debated. It was something they lived. They saw themselves not as isolated beings trying to make sense of a meaningless world, but as participants in something larger, something sacred. And Tolstoy began to wonder, what if faith isn't ignorance, but another kind of intelligence? He didn't convert overnight. He wrestled, questioned, doubted. But the more time he spent with those who live by faith, the more he saw that their strength came not from blind belief, but from surrender, not to unthinking dogma, but to the mystery of life itself. He saw that reason had limits. It could measure the stars, but not explain awe. It could analyze love, but not generate it. It could name the processes of dying, but not touch the human terror of non-existence. Faith, on the other hand, had no such boundaries. It did not need to prove itself. It simply was, alive in the quiet acceptance of suffering, in the dignity of labor, in the eyes of a mother cradling her child. Tolstoy wrote in his later reflections that he began to feel like a man waking from a long fevered dream. He had spent decades demanding certainty, only to realize that life's most essential truths are not certain. They are lived. He no longer needed answers to every question. He needed only the courage to trust what he felt when he stood beside a dying man who smiled, or a farmer who gave thanks for bread he barely had. It was in the lived faith of ordinary people that Tolstoy discovered the peace he had been chasing all his life. And here's something worth pausing for. In our modern world, we often treat faith as outdated, irrational, even embarrassing. But maybe the real embarrassment is how deeply we've distrusted our own hearts. Maybe the wisdom we're searching for doesn't live in complexity, but in the simple act of believing that life is not meaningless, that love matters, that kindness echoes, that suffering isn't the end of the story. If this part of Tolstoy's journey resonates with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that meaning isn't always found in the mind. Sometimes it's waiting in the spaces between words, in the quiet acts of devotion, in the stillness of belief. Tolstoy's rediscovery of faith was not a retreat from reality. It was an opening, a new way of seeing, and it set the stage for the most radical decision of his life, one that would shock the world and change him forever. By the time Tolstoy reached his final revelation, he had become a different man. The glittering world that once surrounded him, the literary salons, the praise of critics, the comforts of wealth, no longer held him. He had seen what lay behind the curtain, and he could not go back. He began to shed everything. He renounced his title, gave away much of his land, refused the royalties from his works, dressed in peasant clothing, chose to walk beside those he once looked past. The man who had once sat at the summit of Russian society now lived among the people who had quietly carried the wisdom he had so desperately sought. This was not performative. It was not political. It was liberation. For Tolstoy had discovered that the source of meaning was not greatness, but humility, not applause, but presence, not legacy, but love. He no longer feared death, not because he had found a way to defeat it, but because he no longer needed to. He saw himself not as a solitary being doomed to vanish, but as part of a vast, living whole. He wrote, "Only by renouncing the illusion of control, only by surrendering to the mystery of life, can we begin to live without fear." His final years were marked not by comfort, but by conviction. He challenged the Russian Orthodox Church. He wrote about peace, about nonviolence, about the sanctity of every human soul. He was excommunicated, criticized, cast out, and yet he smiled more than ever before, because he had found it, the thing he had been searching for his entire life. Not a theory, not an answer, but a way of being, to love, to serve, to surrender, and in doing so, to become free. Let us take a moment here, not just to reflect on Tolstoy's journey, but to look inward. What are we chasing? Whose definition of success are we living? And what if everything we seek is already here, in the quiet moments, in the acts of kindness no one sees, in the courage to be present even when life makes no sense? If Tolstoy's story has stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Reflect, share, reconnect with what truly matters. And if you'd like to keep exploring these deep human stories with us, subscribe to the channel. This is where we ask the questions that linger in the silence and walk with those who have dared to answer them. Tolstoy's journey was not unique to him. It is, in many ways, the journey of us all. And perhaps, just like him, we'll find that meaning was never something to be conquered. It was always something to come home to. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.